"No man survived the night with me," said Giant Bride, but the lonely cowboy said, "Come closer." The town of Desolation Creek earned its name honestly. It clung to existence in the Arizona Badlands like a tick on a dying dog, sustained by a silver mine that was playing out and the stubborn refusal of its inhabitants to admit defeat. The buildings leaned into the wind, the streets stayed perpetually dusty, and hope was a commodity in shorter supply than water. But even in Desolation Creek, where hardship was ordinary and tragedy commonplace, Seraphina stood apart. She lived in a shack on the eastern edge of town, close enough to be part of the community, but isolated enough that people could pretend she wasn't. The shack had belonged to her father, a prospector who died of drink and disappointment. Seraphina had inherited both the property and his unusual size. She stood 6'10", with shoulders like a draft horse and arms corded with muscle that no amount of feminine clothing could disguise. But it was the dress that made her truly memorable. A wedding gown, once white, but now the color of old bones, hung on her powerful frame like a shroud. The lace had torn and been mended with rough thread. The train had been cut short and patched. The bodice strained across a chest built for labor, not lace. She wore it every day, every hour, a constant reminder of what she was, the cursed bride. 3 men had married Seraphina. 3 men had died on their wedding nights. The first had been Jacob Hartwell, a ranch hand who'd courted her with surprising tenderness. He'd seen past her size to something he claimed was beautiful. They'd married on a Sunday in late spring. By Monday morning, he was dead, crushed in their bed, his ribs shattered, his face frozen in an expression witnesses described as ecstasy mixed with terror. The second was Thomas Pike, a widower who'd been drunk when he proposed and too proud to back out when sober. He lasted 3 hours into the wedding night before his heart gave out, his body found with the same expression of overwhelmed pleasure and pain. The third was Michael Chen, half Chinese and desperate enough for acceptance that marrying the town freak seemed worth the risk. He died quickest of all, 30 minutes after the ceremony, before they'd even made it to bed. The doctor said his heart simply couldn't handle the strain. After the third death, the town doctor made a pronouncement that became local legend. That woman's body generates forces beyond human tolerance. She don't mean to kill, but her strength, her passion, her very nature is more than mortal men can survive. She's cursed, and any man who lies with her is choosing death. Seraphina had worn the wedding dress ever since, not from any single wedding, but a amalgamation. Pieces from all 3 ceremonies stitched together into a monument to her deadly nature. She wore it as penance, as warning, as surrender to what she was. For 5 years, she lived alone. People left food on her porch sometimes, out of pity or perhaps fear of what she might do if driven by hunger. She worked odd jobs that required strength, moving freight, breaking stones, any labor too hard for normal folks. She saved her money and spoke to no one and waited, though for what she couldn't say. Then Arthur Whitmore arrived in Desolation Creek. He came on a Tuesday in October, riding a horse that looked as worn out as its rider. Arthur was small, 5'6" in boots, with a kind of thin build that suggested either illness or hard times. His clothes hung loose. His face was gaunt and shadowed, but it was his eyes that made people uncomfortable, empty, in a way that suggested he'd seen something that had hollowed him out from the inside. He took a room above the saloon and spent his first week doing nothing but drinking quietly and staring at walls. The bartender, a woman named Sadie who'd seen her share of broken men, tried to draw him out. "You running from something, honey, or toward something?" "Neither, just running down." "We all got stories. You want to share yours?" Arthur had looked at her with those hollow eyes. "My family was caught in a stampede 3 years ago. Cattle going to market. I was supposed to be with them on the trail, but I'd stayed in town. Cowardice, mostly. Didn't want to face the hard work. They died screaming while I was safe in a boarding house. I've been trying to die with them ever since, but turns out dying takes more courage than I have." Sadie had no response to that. Neither did anyone else who heard the story as it made its rounds. Arthur Whitmore was a ghost, they decided, walking and breathing, but already dead in every way that mattered. 2 weeks into his stay, Arthur was drinking alone when the saloon door opened and conversation stopped. Seraphina stood in the doorway, ducking to clear the frame, her wedding dress dusty from the day's work hauling lumber. She crossed to the bar, and people actively moved away, creating a bubble of space around her. "Whiskey," she said to Sadie. "You know I can't serve you here, Sarah. Not after last time." "Last time was 5 years ago. I'm thirsty. And I'm trying to run a business. People don't drink comfortable with you around." Seraphina's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She turned to leave, and that's when Arthur spoke. "She can have my drink. I'm done anyway." Every head turned toward him. Seraphina studied him, this small, broken man offering his whiskey to the town pariah. "You don't know who I am," she said. "Does it matter? I'm the woman who kills men, 3 husbands, all dead, the cursed bride. You really want to give me your drink?" Arthur pushed the glass across the bar. "I've been trying to die for 3 years. If I had the courage, I'd have done it already. But I don't, so I just keep existing. If you're cursed, maybe you can do what I can't." Seraphina took the glass, drained it in one swallow, and set it down carefully. "You're the saddest man I've ever met, and I've met a lot of sad men. Then we should get along fine." Over the following weeks, an unlikely companionship formed. Arthur would see Seraphina working, hauling stones for a new building foundation, moving barrels at the freight office, and he'd sit nearby, watching without commentary. Sometimes he'd talk, telling her about his family, about the guilt that ate him alive, about the exhausting effort of continuing to exist when existence felt pointless. Seraphina, unused to anyone willingly staying in her presence, found herself responding. She told him about her childhood, about being too big, too strong, too much, about her father's drinking and her mother's early death, about the 3 marriages and the 3 deaths and the 5 years of isolation that followed. "I didn't mean to kill them," she said one afternoon as they sat near the creek. "I never meant any of it. But my body, it's too strong, too intense. When I feel passion, pleasure, even joy, my body responds with force I can't control. It's like being a weapon you can't put down." "I understand that," Arthur said quietly. "Being something dangerous without meaning to be. Though in my case, it's the opposite. I'm dangerous through weakness, through failing to act when action's needed. Maybe that makes us complementary. You're nothing, and my too much. Maybe." 3 months into their strange friendship, Seraphina spoke words she'd sworn she'd never say again. "Marry me." Arthur looked up from the stick he was whittling. What? Marry me. I'm tired of being alone. You're tired of being alive. We could help each other. I'd die. You know that. Your wedding nights are fatal. You just said you want to die. This would at least give your death meaning, and I'd have, even for one night, what everyone else takes for granted: companionship, connection, love, or something close to it. Arthur set down his knife. You're serious? Completely. I'm not asking you to live with me. I'm asking you to die with me, but to die having mattered to someone, even briefly. Is that so terrible? He should have said no. Any rational person would have said no. But Arthur had stopped being rational 3 years ago when his family screamed their last in a dust cloud of terrified cattle. All right, he said, I'll marry you. The town was scandalized when word spread. The mayor tried to talk Arthur out of it. The doctor explained in graphic detail what had happened to the previous husbands. Sadie, the bartender, actually slapped him and called him a fool. I know what I'm doing, Arthur said to each of them. You're committing suicide, Sadie insisted. Yes, but I'm doing it honestly, which is more than I've managed in years. They married on a Saturday in January, with only the traveling preacher as witness. The preacher had tried to refuse, but Arthur had threatened to find someone else, and the preacher decided a blessed death was better than an unsanctified one. Seraphina wore her wedding dress, properly cleaned for the first time in years. Arthur wore his dead father's suit. They spoke their vows in voices that carried resignation more than joy. When the ceremony ended, they walked to Seraphina's shack in silence. The entire town watched from windows and doorways, waiting for the death that would surely come by morning. Inside the small shack, Seraphina lit candles with trembling hands. You can still leave. I wouldn't blame you. I'm not leaving. Arthur, I don't want to kill you, not really, but I can't control what happens when I know. It's all right. Come here. She crossed to him and, for the first time, touched him intentionally, her large hand engulfing his small one. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who'd given up on life, finding unexpected comfort in their mutual surrender. What happened that night was tender and strange and profound. Seraphina had been taught to fear her own passion, to hold back, to compress herself into something manageable. But Arthur, with nothing left to lose, encouraged the opposite. Don't hold back, he whispered. Let me feel all of you. If I'm going to die, let it be knowing what real connection feels like. So she did. She let her strength free, let her passion rise unchecked, let her body respond as it wanted to. And Arthur didn't fight it, didn't try to match her strength or resist her intensity. He simply yielded, accepting everything she was with a surrender born of someone who'd stopped trying to survive. It should have killed him. By all precedent, his heart should have given out, or his body should have been crushed. But yielding proved different from resistance. Where the other men had fought against Seraphina's overwhelming nature, Arthur simply let it flow through him. His brokenness somehow absorbed what would have shattered an intact person. When dawn broke, Arthur woke to find himself alive, exhausted, covered in marks that would purple into bruises, his body feeling like it had weathered a storm, but alive. Beside him, Seraphina slept deeply, her face peaceful in a way he'd never seen before. He lay there watching her, marveling at the impossible fact of his continued existence. When she finally stirred and realized he was still breathing, she actually started crying. "How?" she gasped. "How are you alive?" I think, Arthur said carefully, it's because I didn't try to survive. I wasn't fighting to live through the night. I was just accepting what happened. Your other husbands, they were probably trying to endure, to weather your strength. But I had nothing to endure for. So instead of resisting, I just let go. That doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. But here we are. The town's reaction to Arthur's survival ranged from disbelief to suspicion to outright fear. If Seraphina's deadly nights could be survived, what did that mean? Was she more dangerous now? Less? Was Arthur somehow special? Or had she finally found a way to control her curse? The answer, it turned out, was simpler and more complicated than anyone imagined. Arthur survived because he approached Seraphina without expectation or resistance, and in doing so, he gave her permission to be fully herself, without fear. Over the following weeks, they discovered that Seraphina's curse had never been about uncontrollable strength. It was about the panic of trying to contain something too large for containment. When she stopped fighting herself, when Arthur showed her she didn't need to hold back, her body learned gentleness through acceptance rather than repression. They began building a life together, not a grand life. Their resources were limited, and the town's acceptance was grudging at best, but a real one. Arthur, who'd been sleepwalking through existence, found purpose in partnership. He managed their small household, tended a garden, began writing letters to distant relatives he'd cut off after the stampede. Seraphina continued her labor, but now came home to someone who wanted her there, who looked at her with affection instead of fear. They talked about children, carefully, uncertainly. Could Seraphina carry a pregnancy? Would childbirth be dangerous given her size and strength? They had no answers, only hope that maybe, somehow, they could build something that lasted beyond themselves. 6 months into their marriage, that hope was tested when Silas Crow arrived in Desolation Creek. Crow was a land baron from California, buying up failing properties across Arizona. He'd set his sights on Desolation Creek, convinced the town would die within 5 years and that he could acquire everything cheaply before it did. He'd already bought the saloon, the general store, and several homes. He wanted Seraphina's property next. It sat on the edge of town with access to the creek, making it valuable despite its current condition. Seraphina refused to sell. Her father had died for that land. She'd suffered on it. And now she was finally building something worth keeping. No amount of money would change her mind. Crow didn't take rejection well. He began a campaign of pressure, spreading rumors, encouraging boycotts, making life difficult for anyone who dealt with the couple. When that didn't work, he escalated to intimidation. His men would ride past the shack at night, shooting into the air, shouting threats. The marshal, newly on Crow's payroll, looked the other way. One evening, a delegation arrived at the shack. Crow, the marshal, and 5 armed men. Crow's message was direct. "You're an abomination, a woman who kills men. The town's agreed you need to leave, tonight. Take your broken husband and go, or we'll make you go." Arthur stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the assembled men, but his voice steady. "This is our home, our legal property. You have no right. I have every right. This town doesn't want you. Your cursed wife makes people uncomfortable. Children have nightmares about her. The decent people of Desolation Creek have asked me to clean things up, and that's what I'm doing." "Decent people," Seraphina said, her voice flat. "Or your people. How many of these decent folks are actually on your payroll, Crow? Leave, now, or we'll burn this shack down around you. They might have been run out that night. 2 people against 6 armed men rarely ends well, but fate intervened in an unexpected way. As Seraphina stood to respond, she doubled over with a gasp, her hand going to her swollen belly that she'd been carefully hiding under her dress. "The baby," she managed. "It's coming." The mob froze. No one had known Seraphina was pregnant. The revelation changed the dynamic instantly. Even Crow's hardened men weren't comfortable burning a shack with a woman in labor inside. "Get the doctor," Arthur ordered, his voice carrying authority no one had heard from him before. "Now, unless you want to explain to the territorial marshal why you let a woman and child die." Crow hesitated, but the calculation was obvious. Murdering a woman in childbirth would bring legal consequences even his money couldn't buy off. He sent one of his men for the doctor and settled in to wait, clearly intending to resume the eviction once the complication was resolved. What followed was the longest night of Arthur's life. Seraphina's labor was difficult, her size and strength making the delivery both easier and harder than normal. The doctor worked nervously, acutely aware of the armed men waiting outside. Arthur held Seraphina's hand, absorbed her crushing grip without complaint, and whispered encouragement, even as he fought his own panic. Near dawn, as false light began painting the eastern sky, the baby finally came. A boy, large and healthy, with his mother's size and his father's eyes. His first cry was robust and indignant, announcing his arrival with appropriate drama. Seraphina held her son with trembling arms, tears streaming down her face. "He's perfect. Arthur, he's perfect." "Of course he is. Look at his mother." Outside, the mob had grown as word spread through town. People had gathered to witness the eviction, but now found themselves witnessing something else. Life emerging from the woman they'd called cursed, proof that she was capable of creation rather than just destruction. When Arthur emerged with the baby, needing to show the doctor something about the umbilical cord, the assembled crowd got their first look at the child. And something shifted. You could see it in their faces, the fear transmuting into something else. Wonder, perhaps, or shame, or simple recognition that the woman they demonized was, in the end, just a woman who'd given birth like any other. Crow, sensing his moment slipping away, tried to regain control. "This doesn't change anything. The woman's still a danger. The child will probably be cursed, too. They need to be left alone." The voice came from an unexpected source, Mayor Thornton, who'd been watching from the edge of the crowd. He stepped forward, his face set. "Crow, your business here's done. These people own their property legally. They've broken no laws, and I'm done letting you run roughshod over decent folks just because you've got money." Decent? That woman's killed 3 men. That woman just gave birth. That woman has a husband who loves her and a child who needs her. Whatever happened before, she deserves a chance at peace now, and if you got a problem with that, take it up with the territorial government. But you're done intimidating people in my town. Crow looked around at the assembled crowd, reading the room. The tide had turned against him, not completely. Some faces still showed fear and hostility, but enough that pressing forward would cost him more than retreating. "This isn't over," he said, but it was empty bluster. He and his men rode off, leaving the crowd to disperse slowly, many looking shamefaced. In the aftermath, Seraphina and Arthur sat together in their small shack, their son sleeping between them. The sun was fully up now, promising a hot day. Through the window, they could see people returning to their lives. The drama concluded. "We should leave," Seraphina said quietly. "Crow meant what he said. He'll find another way to come at us." "Maybe, but maybe we stay anyway. Show them we're not afraid. Show our son he doesn't have to hide who he is. You've changed. When you arrived, you wanted to die. Now you're talking about standing your ground." Arthur touched his son's tiny hand, marveling at the perfection of miniature fingers. "I did want to die. I spent 3 years trying to work up the courage. Then I met you, and suddenly dying seemed less important than one more day in your presence. And now," he gestured at the baby, "now I have a reason to live that has nothing to do with courage or fear. I have a family, something worth protecting." Seraphina leaned against his shoulder, a gesture she'd learned he could bear if she was careful. "I never thought I'd have this. A husband who survived me, a child, a home that feels like more than just a place to hide." "You're not cursed, Sarah. You never were. You're just powerful, and power scares people until they see it used for something good." Over the following months, Desolation Creek slowly adjusted to the presence of the couple and their child. Some people never accepted them. Crow continued his campaign from a distance, and certain townsfolk avoided them on principle. But others, especially those who'd witnessed the birth, began to treat them like neighbors instead of pariahs. The widow Chen started leaving fresh vegetables on their porch. The blacksmith hired Seraphina for jobs requiring exceptional strength, paying her fair wages. The school teacher, Miss Abernathy, stopped by to discuss future education for their son, assuming he'd be welcome when the time came. And Arthur, who'd arrived in Desolation Creek, hoping death would finally claim him, found himself transformed by fatherhood and partnership. He grew stronger, not physically, but in spirit. He learned to stand up to people who threatened his family. He even wrote a letter to his surviving relatives, opening a door he'd thought permanently closed. One evening, a year after their wedding, Seraphina and Arthur sat on their porch, watching their son play in the dirt. The child was already larger than other babies his age, showing clear signs of inheriting his mother's size. But he was gentle, careful with the small toys Arthur had carved, thoughtful in his play. "Do you think he'll have my curse?" Seraphina asked. "The overwhelming strength?" "I think he'll have your power. Whether it becomes a curse or a gift depends on how we raise him, how we teach him to understand himself." Arthur took her hand. "You were taught to fear what you are. We'll teach him to accept it, to control it, not through repression, but through understanding. And if people fear him anyway, then he'll know he's loved. That's more than either of us had growing up. It'll have to be enough." Seraphina squeezed his hand gently, a gesture she'd mastered over their year together, applying just enough pressure to convey affection without causing pain. "I love you, Arthur Whitmore. You know that, right?" "I know, and I love you. Even though I came here planning to die in your arms, I'm glad I lived instead." "Because of him?" She gestured at their son. "Because of both of you. Because loving you taught me that broken pieces can still build something beautiful. That the things we think are curses might just be gifts we haven't learned to use properly yet." They sat in comfortable silence as sunset painted the Badlands in shades of purple and gold. In the distance, Desolation Creek continued its stubborn existence, neither thriving nor dying, but persisting the way frontier towns did. And in their small shack on the eastern edge, a family that shouldn't exist by any reasonable standard proved that love required neither perfection nor convention, just courage, acceptance, and the willingness to see past what society declared impossible. The cursed bride and the man who'd survived her. The impossible marriage that produced an impossible child. The couple who taught a frightened town that different didn't mean dangerous, that strength could be gentle, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply allow themselves to be loved. Years later, when people told the story of Seraphina and Arthur, the details would shift and morph the way legends do. But the core truth remained, that a woman thought deadly learned gentleness, that a man seeking death found life, and that their union, born from mutual brokenness, became something whole and lasting and real. And somewhere in there was a lesson about humanity, about the difference between surviving and living, about how the things that make us outliers might be exactly what makes us essential. But mostly, it was just a story about two lonely people who found each other at the exact moment both had given up hope and discovered that sometimes giving up is the first step toward finding something worth holding on to.